American Standard went into production in October of '86. And so they started the line, made a bunch of bodies, and these bodies became the American Standard. The dilemma is, either make guitars out of Poplar, or don't make guitars at all. I've met such guitars in which the gluing is really there, as if in the center. But in fact, it is veneered. I know about it. There are no right or wrong contours. American Standard is always the middle way. This is the people's instrument. It was a stud over. My balls were in the frame. Hello friends, I'm Dr. Anita, and here we are again, on the same sofa with Vasily. In this episode, we'll talk about the American Standard. How did these guitars differ in different periods of time? So, let's go. Okay, then let's talk about the probably most popular American Standard Stratocaster model. A people's instrument. Tell us about it and a little bit about its history. I had a lot of business with American Standard. That is, a large number of these guitars have passed through me, and they are very, very different from each other. To tell this story, you probably need to start from the 80s, specifically in 1981, when CBS hired a few guys from Yamaha in order to improve their business a little, because at the time the quality of the guitars was not very good. But they didn't think about it. They rather thought about the fact that they were losing money on it. So the profits of selling Fender were decreasing. So they decided to hire, so to speak, an anti-crisis team. Dan Smith was one of the key people. Bill Schultz was there. He was in charge of all these matters. But Dan Smith was the one setting the tone. He came in August of '81 from the Yamaha. And naturally, as a normal leader, he was there as a marketing director, if I remember right. For this position, he needed to take a look on the product line. How are they made, how to sell them, and what to change. So he came to the factory, talked there with key people such as John Page, Troy Laney, and just usual guys from the line. And he was terrified. Everyone was talking that they had a lot of problems. The manufacturing quality of the guitars is poor. At the time, the factory was making about 300 guitars a day. And there were only 3 quality inspectors for these guitars, and 6 people assembling them. And you know what? The inspector's job, the more guitars he would inspect, the more salary he gets. For people at the assembly, the more products they finish, the more they get paid. I mean, well, imagine that one person had to assemble 50 guitars a day. That's a rat race, yes. They try to do more, naturally. And when Dan Smith asked the chief quality control inspector about the quality of the product itself, how he sees it, he replied that there are 3% of defective products, which in reality could not possibly be true. What they did the following. He took the guys, John Page took 800 ready-made guitars and decided to double-check them according to the existing verification criteria. To check these guitars, how many guitars do you think were of proper quality? What do you think? How many? 15 guitars. 15 guitars. About 15 guitars. All other guitars were defective. Well, of course, they revised the criteria, even made them easier, and began to modernize production. They started retraining people to make guitars. Sometimes the factory would completely stop at some point, and they would reteach them to make a few guitars a day. They asked the workers not to rush into production, to wait. They asked them to work in a measured manner. Naturally, many did not like that some guys came, we've been making guitars here for 15 years and they're trying to teach us how to make guitars. Plus, of course, most of the leaders. Do you know why did this happen in the first place, actually? Because most people who have held leadership position viewed this job only as a stepping stone in their career. They didn't care about quality. They only thought about how to make more money. And Dan Smith began to change all that. The first change he made was the return of the small, four-balled headstock. Although that was back in '79 when they released the 25th anniversary model. He wanted to get rid of the three-screw mount, the big head, that musicians associated with bad guitars. And so the first slight changes appeared. The first changes to the regular Stratocaster. At that time, there were no models there, as now we have Deluxe, Standard, etc. Then what started later, when they renamed everything? Well, that is, strong marketing has begun. There was a Stratocaster at that time. They put out a couple of other models, for example the Strat or something else. But he had the task of remaking a regular Stratocaster. And the first changes, everything remained practically the same. The material, they continued to make guitars from heavy ash. Because at that time they used a very heavy ash wood. And guitars could end up weighing as much as Les Paul. And not a light one, up to 9 pounds, 10 pounds. It's certainly an overkill. And the first one, that is called Dan Smith Strat. But this is the unofficial name that people came up with, because actually the Strat did not have any name, and it was just a regular model. Well, the people now call it the Dan Smith Strat. What year is this? It's 81, 82. It was presented already redesigned at the exhibition in the 82nd. But the first instruments were still made in 81st, at the end of 1981. Fender often has such a practice that they make something, run a little there, even ship something, and then present this model at the exhibition, with some alteration and some kind of innovation applied. There was also a complete mess with the pickups. It can be found on the first Dan Smith Strats, that is from 81, 82. Pickups wound on a gray fiber, on a red fiber, or on a plastic reel. Most of them had a single X1, which was borrowed from the Strat, which came out a little earlier. And these are more powerful sensors. It is very easy to identify by the yellow wire. While it can be found in the Dan Smith Strat, it may never be found. That was the story. They used what they had. Yes, Dan Smith kept the vintage 7.25 radius. The anchor was also vintage, which was adjusted from the side of the body. The same tuners, the same black logo, that is retained almost all the sores, problems of the regular Strat on the CBS before '81, only with the changes that everyone wanted to get rid of. They wanted to get their reputation back. Although, for example, a micro-tool system adjusting the neck tilt is still used today. It was developed by Leo Fender in 1970 when he was still a consultant and worked for CBS in the development department. He proposed this system: 3 screw mounts, micro-tool, and a bullet on the head. They were his designs. In fact, there is nothing wrong with them. Just the thing is that they were associated with bad guitars, that's all. Here, most likely, there was just a marketing ploy to get rid of it and make the guitars different from those before. And indeed, the quality began to get better. The second model, that is, which already had the name American Standard, appeared in '83. And which many people mistakenly also called Dan Smith Strat because it was the era of Dan Smith, and for marketing reasons they call it that. But this is actually not the case. Basically, because the model already had a name, and it has already been redone. Everything has already changed there. The guitars were already significantly better quality than the previous releases. They were already better done, because after all, there was some kind of modernization. People were taught to do their job well. They really fought for the quality of the guitar. But it had changes due to the fact that naturally it was necessary to reduce the cost of the guitars in order to regain its popularity, because the Stratocaster fell in price in '83. They made some not very popular things like tremolo free fly, that is, the springs were attached under the pickguard. For the first time, the reflex double-sided anchor was developed. It appeared on this model with headstock adjustment. There were already such tuners with a Fender inscription, and a new silver logo appeared. There was such vintage body contouring. Well, of course, they also removed it for some reason. Well, not for some reason, it's clear that it was done due to reduction in price. They removed this boat, where jack plate is, and instead of the second tone, they put an input there in order to connect the guitar. Also to cut the costs. There was no spring block at the back of the body, of course, because they were already attached under the pickguard. They made a special miling for all this. In fact, a completely different design. Yes, they have already changed the design a lot. There's also a very interesting feature. It's the 12th radius, that is a very flat radius, like Les Paul has, yes. Yes, like Les Paul, but it's 83-84 when the 12th radius is found on Fender guitars, because further, it has no longer there. I must say that for the Fender maniacs out there, fans of the Fender guitar, that is not a very popular move to this day. Therefore, it was not used on the following models. But that was the case on the first American Standard, which ran from '83 to '84. It also had a polyester primer with a polyurethane finish. And at the end of '84, when all production was already established and everything was fine, CBS announces that they are going to sell the business. Since there were no buyers inside, Bill Schultz and all the geeky guys from Yamaha offered them to buy this business. And so it was sold. But the Fullerton factory was not part of the deal. Only equipment was included, some remnants from production lines, that is bodies, necks, linings. And they came there and chose. We will take this machine, we will not take this one, everything in this mode. And they decided to build a new factory in Corona. The first guitars to be released on the assembly line in Corona in 1985, at the end of 85, were the American Vintage series, because they were the most popular. American Standard was introduced a little later. George Bland became the chief engineer, who was responsible for the revision of the American Standard. And all the innovation, practically most of the innovation, was done by him. American Standard entered production in October of '86. But it was presented at the January exhibition of NAMM in the 87th, although they had already made these guitars. The first thing that catches your eye on the guitars of the first production period is a new tremolo on 2 screws with stamped steel saddles, a pull cutout for all the sensors. You could put whatever you wanted. Here, for the first time, 22 threads appeared on the Fender. Changed the radius again to 9.5. There was a sublux anchor. The silver Fender logo has been preserved. The previous tuners. The pickups were also flush with the cores, that is, with everything equal. They were making guitar from alder or ash, depending on the color. And the early standards had more rounded outlines, that is, closer to vintage outlines. Why was that? Because then they were developing a signature model for Yngwie Malmsteen. And he was, in this sense, a very scrupulous guy, and asked that the counter ones were not angular, but rather rounded, that is, vintage. They soon moved on to angular bodies with less counter milling. And in principle, the early standards up to 1990 were quite good for their money. The most important changes took place in the 1990, and this lasted a whole decade. This is a veneer, about which Fender was silent for a long, long time. Yeah, this is an interesting topic because there is a lot of myths about it. What then were guitars made of in the 90s? Why are they so popular with us? The fact is that, for example, the Americans, well, the green Americans, they have limited the sowing of alders in Oregon. That is where Fender got its supply of alder. Well, of course, it has become more expensive. Of course, they write that, well, they have limited everything for us here, but guys, they just would have to pay more for alder. But they switched to Poplar. And as Dan Smith says, of course, it's colorful and beautiful, but I call it making excuses. That we had such a dilemma, either to make guitars from Poplar or not to make guitars at all. Well, this is certainly not true. And they began to make guitars out of Poplar. But these guitars began to be covered with veneer, with olive veneer or ash, depending on the color. It worked until 1994. Naturally, when these nuances were revealed in the West, because many people in the West already know, maybe not everyone in our space knows about it. And when it began to surface, the Fender began to justify itself in such a way that we began to put veneer there, because complaints came from dealers that the varnish was failing, that the paint was applied unevenly, we used veneer to make it generally flawless, this is just for quality. In fact, this is completely bogus it's hard to believe when you hear things like that, and you just understand that in the first 4 years of the 90s, they actually just were hiding Poplar. Naturally, we hear other excuses there. Oh, well, Poplar is just as good wood, that Jackson used Poplar, that the Music Master was also using Poplar back in the 60s, that this is good wood for making instruments. This is clear. But why are you covering it with elder veneer there? And they did it very cleverly. Most often, even the veneer could be thrown, for example, in half, and there with gluing in the center. That is, they didn't put it on, like on Maxis, totally. The entire series was covered with veneer and no gluing was visible at all. That is, the Americans did it in a very, very sophisticated way. I've met such guitars on which the gluing is really there, as if in the center, but in fact, this is veneer, and I know about it, because having studied all this information, I got to the bottom of the truth. All the 90s guitars were completely veneer. Why was it necessary to cut the veneer in the center to show that it was elder? But this is easily recognized because on Sunburst guitars, the cutout under the belly was closed, was painted completely in black. Yeah, so that the edges are not visible. Yes, that's right, so that the edges are not visible, and it was not clear what they used here. Oh, that's cunning. Yeah. And the thing is, it could have been believed if it hadn't continued. That is, in 94, towards the end of 95, they switched back to elder and ash. But the veneering did not stop. That is, veneering lasted until 2000. And all the same was the pull under the sensors. Why veneer then? They glued them from slats. Apparently not of the best quality. Personally, of course, I did not rip them off, but according to the pictures of people who did, who repainted these guitars and removed the veneer, there were knots in 5 pieces, and well, that is just a furniture shield. It was disgusting. The miling for the pickups has changed since 1998. That is, there was a humbucker, single humbucker, and since 97 there have been additional round holes in the neck pocket and under the pull. But this is most likely because the fastening to the machine of the body itself has changed. They serve to fasten the workpiece. But this is a very important detail because it's so easy to determine whether your Stratocaster is assembled from different years or not, because it was only in 97 that these holes appeared. Until 97 there were none. Because you can buy there, for example, a Standard that has a neck of 1 year and the body of another. And according to the serial number in the neck, we look at one thing, but according to the other parameters, we see discrepancies. Yeah. So such things have appeared. And as for the logos, silver remained until 94, practically the Poplar Era. And in 94 they presented the anniversary model. There was an additional badge on the headstock. And after that, they already changed the logo to spaghetti. That is the classic one that was in the 50s and the 60s under Leo Fender, but without the inscription original counterbody, because the counters were not original. They were square. That's not much from the original at all. Yes, because they were not countered correctly. Not vintage, not like American Vintage series. Although on the vintage series, which was produced in the 90s, they were exactly the same Agler. The only difference is that there was no pull, but there was a miling for each sensor, miling for each single. The headstock changes slightly by the 1999. It becomes so, well, it is difficult to say correct or authentic because in principle in the 50s and 60s it was all a manual procedure, and the headstock of a Stratocaster, for example, they may differ. They apparently took from a certain template and slightly changed it to the one we are used to seeing on modern guitars now. That is, it started in 1999. In principle, that's probably all about the 90s. I'll tell you how easy it is to identify the 90s guitar. Poplar that or Alder. Because as many argue that Alder was sometimes found in early 90s, but I have not seen evidence of this. And I believe that everything was made from Poplar. But this is easily determined. Poplar is quite loose, and when mild, such shavings remain from it. Yeah, it's fluffy. It's furry, so to speak. If you look inside, it is clear that it was all painted up with a layer of polyester soil, and covered with polyurethane on top. It will still be visible in all of these, in the same pool, for example, such friability as if shavings. This is definitely would be Poplar. If the surface is very smooth, it might be Alder, but I do not believe that during this period they could have made some selected specimens from Alder. It's hard to believe in this. While on the internet some people think so, but I have not seen such things, so I cannot confirm it. So the next American Standard period began in June 2000, and it lasted until January 2008. The series was revised and redone and renamed. That is, the American Standard began to be called simply American Series, and very important changes took place. For me, this is a very favorable period of time when, in principle, very good standards were made. Firstly, we remember that they removed the pool, and a little earlier, and continued this practice in this period. That is, there was already a single humbucker cutout. The contours of the body have changed very much. They have become smoother, more vintage. They removed the veneer to hell. Finally. The instruments were made from alder or ash. The second retainer was removed from the head, by the way. Previously they used two. They removed one and remained only under the first and second strings, and made compensated tuners in height. Due to this, they also revised what other important features? In general, all other things remained the same. That is nothing new. The same delta tone remains, which allows us, that is, on the lower tone knob, when it is completely off, it removes the tone itself from the chain. That is, it does not participate in sound, and it's soundless. Therefore, it's good. And they began to install profiled cores. They first appeared. Yeah, they got them back. Yes, they brought it back because it wasn't there before. They too were on plastic spools, but there were already profiled cores. Because of this, the compensation of the sound of each string is better when it is all matched together. And the rest, actually, everything remained unchanged, but the quality has improved significantly. This is a very favorable period, even in terms of price. If you look at the prices for these instruments on the secondary market, they are priced nicely. And so I would advise you to pay attention. Although during this period of time, of course, the varnish remained thick enough. But otherwise, everything else, the problems of the 90s are gone. What paint did they use? Well, all the same continued, that the same polyurethane, the same polyester primer, yes, and polyurethane on top, yes, and the neck is covered with matte polyurethane. But in principle, the American series, which they called that, are really good instruments. They are a result of them stopping doing nonsense. The next period, as I call it, American Standard Swan Song. That is from 2008. They revised the Standard Stratocaster again and returned the American Standard name again. And it was manufactured until 2016, but certain changes were made, not only with the renaming, but there was the following changes. Firstly, the tremolo changed, block saddles disappeared. They began to make vintage bend saddles, and the distance between the strings has decreased due to this saddles. The strings have moved slightly away from the edges. We often see on a Stratocaster that the first string breaks or is thicker towards the edges. They managed to move them a little and it became more convenient to play. This is really, really very good news. They changed the kneel of the tremolo. They increased its mass, although the shape was left wedge, the wedge shaped, but they changed its mass. It became heavier, which has a positive effect. Every Stratocaster user knows that the kneel of the tremolo affects the sound, very much even. Has the key material changed? No, as was carbon steel. Only copper was added to it, and due to this, its mass has changed. The nail itself remained the same wedge shape. It is not the same as on vintage Fenders, not a thick block, but this wedge-shaped one. An interesting situation has emerged. Many do not know, and many are scared with this transition to 2010. There's a little such thing with serial numbers. 2010, for example, American Standard. The serial number can just start with 10. Or more often, even this unit looks like the letter I, English, Latin. And what do you think it is? In the meantime, in the same year, 2010, serial numbers have gone to start with US, United States type, and then were a dozen, for example. That is, before the year 2010, they may not have this US prefix, but simply start with a dozen, with a 10. There are many of my clients who have contacted me, or not clients, they're, friends, for example, asked, what kind of thing is this? Maybe a fake serial? It's funny, but there's such a fact. Also, something new was that they began to cover the headstock with a glossy varnish, while the back was matte. And they showered us with custom shop Fat 50s. That is, custom shop Fat 50s pickups appeared. it also had a positive effect. That is, what is the trend? Growth was happening all the time. They are, apart from these 90s, which were not very favorable. Then there was a real continuous improvement in the quality of instrument making. They started to apply really useful things. And so when I'm asked the question, which American standard should I choose? I answer, the younger, the better. That is from 2017. We will no longer talk about this because there has been a total renaming of all the series. And American Standard went out of use and the professional came to us. Professional great guitars. There is already Professional 2. They released it. That is, such marketing has already begun there. All renaming may not correspond to their corporate image. The name is American Standard. Maybe they just thought that somehow, I don't know. Maybe they got tired of it. Well, it's more of a just, add more pathos. That is, professional sounds like, what is this? No. Basically, professional are great guitars. Well, there were a lot of changes there. Well, not a bunch, but some positive changes, which are still tuned to the musicians. Such as there's a cat, for example, under the arm, as in deluxe, to make it easier to crank up to the distant frets. They moved well, for example, these are the things they did. This is nice for many, for example, for modern musicians. Well, except for me, I don't care. I still like the classic version more. But in general, we can summarize that American Standard is always the golden middle. It's a people's instrument that was for ordinary guys who just want an American Fender. And the innovations that they have always made and changed in Fender, well, maybe not always as we understand with Poplar. And with all these veneered cases, they have always been beneficial. They just took a regular vintage Strat and made useful changes to it. Well, so that's the story. Listen, you also talked about how the guys ran to the shops and bought vintage Stratocasters in order to somehow restore the blueprints. Yeah, it happened. If we go back to the very beginning of the story, the story is this. In the 1980, they released the model, the Strat, and it had a funny form of the head. It was small and completely unlike the old vintage head, because all the blueprints were simply lost. Nobody kept it. And when Dan Smith came, they drove to a vintage musical instrument store and started measuring the guitars. They unrolled the details and measured the sizes. And then they bought the best examples of these instruments as a reference. Yeah, they bought them for the company itself in order to completely disassemble the instruments and see how exactly this was done once. It's a paradox happened when the company buys its products in order to restore its memory. Oh, how did we do it? I will try to remember. Yeah, it's quite funny. They bought guitars and thus launched the American Vintage series in '82, back at the old Fullerton plant. It was made from blueprints taken from the original guitars. Of course, many vintage purists say that some things were wrong, that markers are wrong, for example, but most of those who complained were wrong, since the correct Stratocaster simply did not exist. All operation at the Fullerton plant were manual. That is, all things were done by hand on machine tools. and not on CNC, not with machine control, where the machine itself does the work on the body. Therefore, everything depended on the quality of the source material. Therefore, for example, we can meet a 1962 Stratocaster, which will have rounded outlines on one guitar and slightly square on the second. In the places of the cutout for the arm and for the belly, they will never be the same at all, because it was all done by hand and depended on the workload in production. That is, many people noticed that the contours have become smaller. There were two periods closer to 1965 when a lot of Stratocasters were released, and for example by the end of the 70s when a lot of them were released. In those days, at least, it was considered a lot. Therefore, there are no right or wrong contours. And they used averages on American Vintage. They took the very best from every guitar and used it in their instrument making. I'm very glad that Vasily and I managed to meet and talk so productively. I think it was very interesting for you. But that's not all, because in the next series we will talk about custom shop and master builds. This is also a very interesting topic that has a lot of nuances. So press the bell, subscribe to the channel, like and ask your questions in the comments. Visit my Patreon. There's a lot of interesting information for the makers there, for those who make guitars. And now, I say goodbye to you, but not for long.
Rock and roll for all.